you will see from what Angus has said the extraordinary breadth of the set of issues that we're going to be thinking about for the next several years. And you'll also, I hope, see in the next hour or so, with the panel you have in front of you, the sheer scale of different expertise and experience that we will, or at least part of that scale that we'll bring to bear. Now, the way I'm going to try and do this is to talk to each of the panel members here. I'll introduce them as I do that, and then leave some time at the end to get some questions from the floor. And I'm going to ask some fairly basic and naive questions, because I think actually partly that's what drew us to this topic. What is it about inequality that we're concerned about? What are the sorts of things that we should be doing about it? So let me start with Deborah Satz, as a distinguished philosopher from Stanford University, who's been thinking, I think, for much of her life about inequality and what matters about it. And Deborah, just last week, the IFS, we celebrated our 50th birthday. So in celebrating that, I sort of look back at what the world looked like 50 years ago. And the world 50 years ago, or at least the UK 50 years ago, was a much more equal society, but we were much poorer. Life expectancy was much lower. Right across the income distribution, incomes were lower by a factor of about 3. So that really does raise the question, why are we worried about inequality as such? One can understand about worrying about low living standards or poverty, but what we're looking at here specifically is inequality in a wealthy country. Why are we concerned about inequality?
Great question. Can everybody hear me? So there's not one answer to that. Sometimes the most, as you say, simple and naive questions reveal the complexity and sophistication of an issue. Inequality, you're right, in general doesn't matter in itself. It often matters because of its causes or its consequences. So you can think about inequality that's due to unfairness or rent-seeking, opportunity hoarding. The way inequality comes about can matter to our moral assessment of it. Similarly, the consequences of an inequality can matter. So if economic inequality brings wealth, but also brings unequal political power, or is a threat to democracy, or leads some people to have inferior social status because they're excluded from opportunities in the society, that consequence matters. So there isn't going to be a single answer to the question of which inequality, why should we care about inequality, but a myriad set of answers which will pull on both the causes and the consequences. Having said that, I also think there are some kinds of inequality we might think of as constitutively wrong. So I don't have to look to the causes or consequences of slavery to think that kind of inequality between slaveholder and slave is objectionable. So there are some forms of inequality that are constitutively objectionable. That isn't going to be, I think, and this will be something to be worked out, economic inequality. So inequality of income and wealth doesn't seem to me to be constitutively objectionable, but it does seem objectionable because of the consequences it can have or because of the causes of that inequality. So I think that matters to our assessment of it. Clearly not all equality is desirable and not all inequalities are undesirable. There's I forget the short story which talks about we could make people equal in a world where some people are blind and others are not by blinding everybody. There's nothing superior about a world in which everybody is blind versus a world where some people are blind and some people aren't, which just, I think, shows that inequality in itself isn't often the issue. It's what it leads to or what gives rise to it.
Would it be fair to say that there is a degree of inequality which is necessary and indeed morally desirable if it arises from wealth creation or effort or skill or all those sorts of things? Because I don't think there are many people who think that all inequality is a problem.
So I don't think all inequality, as I said, I don't think we want to equalize in all dimensions. Some inequalities are desirable because, for example, we're all different, and it would be really bad if everybody in a society were formed by the same cookie cutter. It's really good that people are unequal and different along different kinds of dimensions, so we have different excellences and virtues. And on the other hand, some kinds of inequalities are objectionable, as I said. So I don't think and I do think there are trade-offs between inequality and other values, and it's a question to ask whether things could be done to ameliorate those trade-offs. So I don't actually think there's a necessary trade-off between inequality and wealth creation. That's an empirical, I leave that, in a way, I'm a philosopher, I can leave that to the social scientists, but it's, I think, an open question how much inequality is actually good for wealth creation. It's certainly true that there's probably an extent of inequality that is not good for wealth creation. So there are going to be trade-offs. Part of, I think, of the task of a philosopher, not a social scientist, is to really help identify all the different dimensions of inequality so that we're paying attention to which dimensions matter, and then say something about the trade-offs between those different dimensions and different values that might be at stake in mitigating inequalities.
Well, you're talking our language when you're talking about trade-offs and looking at the specific issues that constitute it, because hopefully that's what we do and what we'll continue to do. Let me move on to Tim Besley next on my right. Tim is a professor at the London School of Economics, an economist by background, but very much a political economist, I think it would be fair to say. I mean, Tim, one of the things I think you've been thinking about quite a lot is the legitimacy of market outcomes and the legitimacy of where we end up in terms of inequality. I wonder if you'd like to sort of say a little bit more about that and where we might think inequalities are legitimate and where they might not be.
Yeah, so this, first time I started thinking about this, I was sent to an economics training program just after the fall of communism. And those of us who were sent on those programs were given people who could speak English, who'd often been members of the security services, to go around with us. And I remember going down the street, and it was just the time the market had started to emerge in Russia. So people were literally on the sides of the street starting to sell items that had been scarce under communism. And the former intelligence officer who was sitting beside me in the car started to point all this and said, speculators, speculators, this is terrible. This is a terrible reform. It's only going to lead people who don't deserve to get rich. And it kind of brought home to me that often the way we think about inequality is deeply embedded in the kinds of processes that generate those outcomes, whether they be market processes or government processes. So maybe we should give you a couple of examples. One is most people who denounce inequality as grotesque will rarely tell you that professional footballers are paid too much, especially in a week when 4 of our teams ended up in European finals. But if you think about the process generating of that, the rents that are created by the Premier League from TV deals, effectively exploiting the willingness of people to fork out large amounts of money to watch it under exclusive deals, it is part of an elaborate system of generating rewards through economic rents that ultimately go to the people who bang in the goals on a Saturday afternoon and make us all feel better about ourselves. But I think few people think that that's an illegitimate form of inequality, perhaps given the way it's unpacked. So that's sort of one example. But let me give you another example from my research that I'm doing at the moment with Steve Machin, where we've been looking at inequality among head teachers in state schools. So in about 1997, the typical ratio of state school head to the median teacher was around 2 to 1. By 2014, it had risen as 3 to 1. So now head teachers are much better paid than rank and file teachers. At the same time, the within head teacher inequality has gone up from the 90-10 ratio being about 1.3 to 1.6. So we've seen a very dramatic change in inequality among head teachers. Now, that may be fully justified by the demands of the task, the complexity of the role they're now being asked to play, the responsiveness of schools to school improvements that have now been engineered by those head teachers. Or we can think that they've just figured out a better way to engage in rent seeking, to raise their pay at the expense of rank and file teachers. It really matters how we think about the process generating that inequality, our response to it. Now, I don't have an answer to what I think is going on in that case. That's very much research in progress. But I think those two examples illustrate really well just how the processes matter that generate inequality. And it's kind of subtle. You can't just sort of denounce things. You have to go under the skin of the process that's generated the outcome and reach a view.
And Tim, I wonder if you could comment a little more on what Angus was saying about meritocracy. I mean, it's, as we all know, it was introduced as a sort of negative term, but has become more positive. And I think we're all, probably particularly people in this room, to some extent meritocrats and believe in the in reward for effort and skill and so on. And yet it has, as Angus was suggesting, it can have some negative consequences. What are the alternatives to meritocracy, I guess?
That's a very good question. Well, let me bring an example that's on my mind thinking about this, which is political representation. And again, coming back to something that Paul Collier argues in his book on the future of capitalism, he argues that essentially the social democratic movement that brought many changes in society was essentially motivated by a kind of elite opinion based on some kind of utilitarian justification, that we as the political elite are doing good things for our citizens and we deserve to be re-elected on the basis of the good that we're doing. The fact that there was a great social distance between the people who were doing this and the people they were represented seemed not to matter at all. What we've seen, and I think the Sweden example is a really striking one, is a lot of the new, particularly populist political movements are about an anti-elite field. It's not sufficient to justify it that these people are doing the best they can for the people that they're serving. And the Sweden Democrats are a good example because if you look at the emergence of this whole new class of politicians, and remember in Sweden it's about 20% of the vote now is going to the Sweden Democrats, which is a far-right party, they look exactly like the people they represent. So people are crying out for representatives that seem to be ascriptively similar to themselves. So there was a kind of meritocratic justification of the political system we had, that we put people in place on the basis of merit and they will do good and what's right for the people they represent. But I think that's a very interesting and questionable proposition, particularly in view of the fact that all these new political movements, what are they doing? They're bringing new people into politics who look like the people who vote for them. And as my colleague Simon Hicks at LSE has shown, there's been a very marked decline in voting for social democrat parties in the last 20 years throughout Europe. And part of it is this ascriptive representation. People just don't look at the representatives there and say, they are like me, they're the people who have got my interests at heart. And I think that's a kind of political byproduct of the phenomenon you're talking about.
Well, that's going to be quite a thing to look at some more. I'm now going to turn to Lucinda Platt, a sociologist at the LSE, and I'll ask another rather naive question. We've been talking about inequality overall. You look at inequality particularly with a focus on gender and ethnicity. Why should we worry about that specifically as opposed to inequality overall? And clearly we should, but what are the reasons for that and what are the big issues in thinking about that?
Thank you for that question. Yes, so I spent a lot of time thinking about differences between ethnic groups, differences between minority ethnic groups and the majority, and what those inequalities are. And we sometimes think of those as kind of horizontal inequalities. So are poverty rates worse for Bangladeshi children than for white majority children, for example? And if they are, then I think that's a concern. But I think what's important to integrate into that perspective is the ways in which you can't separate those horizontal inequalities, those group-based inequalities, from what's happening more generally in terms of inequality. So where there are wide differences across the distribution, then those groups who are most marginalised will suffer more. So there are consequences of what's happening in terms of inequality for them. And also the consequences of inequality in terms of how people feel relative inequality as a challenge to their status is likely to make them look more for scapegoats, look for others who they can marginalise more. So you can't, in that sense, separate processes of discrimination and prejudice and racism from inequality very directly. So I think those are some reasons, and I think the other reason why it's worth looking at differences between groups is because it can tell us something more about some of the processes, perhaps because of some of the anomalies we see. So you mentioned gender there, and if we look at differences across ethnic groups among men and among women, we see quite different patterns. For example, if you look at something like wages, for many minority groups have higher average wages than white majority women. Their pay gaps are smaller, whereas the men tend to have pay gaps relative to white British men. So what's the process there? What does that make us understand about gender differences in gender pay gaps, those sorts of inequalities? What does it tell us about the processes relating to ethnicity? And to give one other example, we know that, and this has been happening increasingly, it's been happening very fast, ethnic minority children and young people are doing better in education now than the white majority. This is a very striking phenomenon, even across the most disadvantaged groups. So educational attainment is not sensitive to social origins in the way that it is for the majority. So how does that make us think about social mobility? How does it make us think about the role of social origins? If, and I see this at LSE, I have women who study with me whose mothers didn't work, don't necessarily even speak much English, Bangladeshi women, and they're studying at the LSE, they're getting good degrees. How does that happen? And what can we learn from it? But also, what can we learn from the fact that some of these women they go into the civil service, they get fantastic jobs. We know that others really struggle to translate those sorts of educational qualifications into the labour market. So again, that brings us back to discrimination. So I think it gives us a much better way of thinking about some of the processes that are going on in perpetuating inequality.
And I suppose, to ask another difficult question, one of the questions is what can we learn from some of that, and what can we do about it? Because some of what you're describing in terms of the success in education reflects different things that are going on within the home, and some of the things that you're reflecting in terms of maybe women from different ethnic minorities doing very differently also reflects what's going on within the home or within the community. And that raises big questions about the role of policy or the role of government in trying to affect that, both either in terms of improving outcomes in the majority white working class, or indeed in changing things within some of those ethnic communities. I mean, how difficult is it? How sensitive is it to take some of that and then turn it into things that we, the government, or they, the government, should be doing?
They are complex issues, and people get very sensitive when you start thinking about can we interfere in families, can we change families. It doesn't stop policymakers trying, and in fact, indeed, focusing a lot on the whole parenting agenda. So maybe we need to think more carefully about what the expectations actually are, and unpick some of those expectations and assumptions about good parenting, bad parenting, what constitutes a home environment that fosters education and what doesn't. And then thinking about minority ethnic communities, obviously there's a huge focus in the literature on participation rates of particularly Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. So the one thing that everybody knows is that the participation rates of Bangladeshi and Pakistani women are low. But what we also know is that the unemployment rates of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women are very high. So I think we have to think about how those factors interact. So what is it about, maybe there are issues about sort of local community norms, but there are also, we keep hearing the word trade-offs, there may be also trade-offs. What's going on in terms of the family, what's going on in terms of earning power, what's going on if when you do try and get a job in the labour market, you can't as well.
And again, this is going to be the subject of several pieces of work that we're going to be doing over the next over the next period, and clearly, relates to what both Tim and Deborah have been saying in terms of what we think is reasonable or fair in terms of outcomes. Let me move on now to Penny Goldberg, who we're delighted to have, who is the chief economist at the World Bank, as well as a distinguished economist in academia. Penny, we've talked about sort of some of the philosophical questions, as it were, about what matters in terms of inequality. I suppose one of the things that people sometimes say is, given what's happening to technology, given what's happening to globalization, that there are just irresistible forces which are driving us towards greater inequality in developed countries. Is that something that you buy into? Do you think we have much bigger external forces driving higher inequality in terms of earnings and employment and so on than we've had in the past? Or is this something which is much more manageable than that narrative would suggest?
So I think there are definitely big forces driving inequality. You mentioned two, globalization and technology, automation. I would argue that this doesn't mean that these forces are greater than in the past. These forces have been present also in the past. And the fact that these forces are present doesn't mean that inequality is destiny. So yes, both globalization and automation create inequalities, but there are many policies that can counterbalance these effects. So for example, let's take the case of globalization first, the case of trade. So we know, based both on theory and also on empirical work, that globalization tends to create winners and losers. And these winners and losers can be located in very different countries. For example, if you look at the basic predictions of trade theory, these predictions imply that workers in advanced economies, like the UK, like Europe, should have benefited from trade with developing countries, and vice versa, workers in developing countries should have benefited from trade with more advanced countries. So these are predictions that trade theory has delivered. It turns out if you take these predictions to the data, they're not always confirmed. So sometimes the priors are not confirmed by the patterns we see in the data. That said, the basic trends in the last few decades at a global scale have been consistent with priors, in the sense that we saw economies like China or Korea or Taiwan, economies that integrate in the world trading system, growing very fast. We saw workers in many advanced countries, in the US, in the UK, we saw unskilled workers being hurt. We saw their wages stagnating, as Angus mentioned. So it's very natural to link this phenomena with the rise in global trade. So to me, the question of whether or not trade creates inequality, the answer to this question seems rather obvious. How we address it is less obvious.
I was going to come on to that. So, perhaps that is an unfair question, but I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that whilst for a lot of people increased trade and technology has increased average incomes, there's been a focused group of losers, those with lower skills, those with particular industries, those often in particular communities. Do we know much about what are effective ways of cushioning people who are in industries or communities who are suffering as a result of technological or economic change? Or is that something that really, we as a commission are going to have to start from pretty much step one in terms of coming to what the appropriate policy responses should be?
So it may seem surprising, but actually we know relatively little about who the winners and who the losers actually are. So we know that there are winners and losers, but one of the perhaps most surprising insights of empirical work in the last few years has been has been documenting that there is a spatial dimension to the losses from trade. So it's not so much people in particular sectors or even people with particular skills who lose from trade. It's people located in certain areas that are particularly affected by trade that tend to lose, at least in the short and medium run. So that was a relatively new insight. In retrospect, it may seem obvious, but it's not an insight people had in advance. And without this insight, you wouldn't know how to target compensating policies. So that's one more reason you need research, and you need actually open-minded research, because for a long time, trade economists, so mainstream trade, questioned the premise that trade had big distributional effects. This may seem surprising because that's exactly what trade theory implies. But nevertheless, in practice, people were reluctant to even admit that trade would have these adverse effects. So step one is to identify who wins and who loses. And as I said, one important dimension of this loss is this spatial, is the geographical dimension. Once you have identified the losers, then the question is, what are the proper policies to address this issue? One obvious one seems encouraging mobility, to the extent that all these effects are driven by lack of mobility, lack of geographical mobility. One needs to think, why is mobility constrained? Are there economic reasons for that? Is it that people are psychologically tied to the people where they live, and so on? So that raises a bunch of other questions that we can think about.
Of course, mobility creates some of the problems that Angus was referring to, which is that if the most able and the most ambitious leave the area, then the area can fall even further behind, or it might be good for the individuals but bad for those left behind. So again, there are always trade-offs with these sorts of things. Before I come to the floor, I mean, Angus, I just wanted to ask you to sort of reflect a bit more on your experience of comparing the US to the UK and indeed other countries, because I think it's fair to say that the US, there is a certain degree of US exceptionalism here, and it's going to be important for us as a commission not to be driven too much by that experience, because the UK and other countries are clearly different. But to what extent do you genuinely see the US as its degree of inequality and some of the serious problems that you've observed as a risk for the UK, and to what extent do you think we are inoculated against that by our different institutions?
I think both of those. So, the fatuous answer is yes. But it's a very interesting question. I mean, when the Scottish Enlightenment was exported from Scotland to America via Princeton, New Jersey, incidentally, and led by a Scottish Presbyterian minister, the Reverend John Witherspoon, who had a vision in Paisley, I think, where he was, that the kingdom of heaven was going to come in America and not in Scotland, where he heretofore thought it was going to happen. And so he went to Princeton and started teaching people, including, perhaps most importantly, James Madison, who was his pupil, as to the principles of the Scottish Enlightenment. But then the histories begin to diverge. Why these welfare states that have grown in Europe never really took root in the United States. And Danny Roderick wrote a long time ago that it's countries like Denmark that are small and are very open to trade that have been very successful in building very active labor market policies to cushion people against those things. So part of the reason we don't have those in America is America was a very big country that didn't really have any trade relative to the size of the country. So, trade didn't really bother Americans all that much. It's not quite true. Obviously, there were episodes. And of course, automation has really caught America in a way that affects all European countries. You don't get that. The other thing, and this is something that I think to some extent you're protected against, a huge amount of what happens in the history of this in America has to do with race. It's to do with race, it's to do with the inheritance of slavery, and it's to do with the fact that again and again and again, white politicians would not put policies in place that would help black people. And I was just reading today an account of the establishment of Social Security and indeed of a National Health Service, which was in a bill that spent 3 to 4 years in front of Congress in the 40s in the Truman administration. And it basically failed because the Southern Democrats, who represented the landed aristocracy like the British in the 19th century, simply would not support it and would not get together with the Northern Democrats who were supporting unions who wanted this. And so you just couldn't get it done. And that's the history over now. And even today, if you look at local welfare states, and a tremendous amount of welfare of the support network in the US is local, state in nature. The states that have large fractions of African American population have the lowest replacement ratios for anything. So it's still there, and it's still alive, and it still curses everything that happens in America. I mean, that original sin is still hurting us forever. And you don't have that in the same way. Not in the same way at all. I'm not saying this is a sin-free polity. Surely isn't. But I mean, I don't think you can blame Brexit on slavery, for instance. Maybe you can. But I think if you wanted me to identify one big thing, it's the sort of size and the race. Maybe the other way around, race and then size.
Well, it's interesting what you say about the long impact of slavery in history. I mean, one of the things that you referred to in your talk, and I think is very evident, is that short-term shocks can have very long-term impacts on inequality. We know that particularly at a regional level, but also at a family level, these can last for generations. So I guess that anything that we come up with in terms of a commission is going to be talking about things that will make a difference over a long period rather than next year.
That's right. I mean, and I think, the stories that Ann Case and I are telling about deaths of despair are things that have taken a long time to put in place. I mean, it's a gradual drip that destroys not just wages, but family lives and jobs and the society that surrounds that. And that's not something that happens overnight. I mean, it's not like a nuclear bomb, but it has some of the same effects over a very long period. The good thing about that is it gives you time to stop it. And I do think the situation in Britain is, you should be looking across the Atlantic and saying, what can we make sure that this does not happen here? And there's some really obvious things like controlling opioids, for instance, which would be, you understand, but it's not easy. And there's things like fentanyl, which is being imported all over Europe. It's very, very high density. It's about 100 times more potent than heroin. It's very easy to transport, very difficult to stop. And so, those problems are there, and it's worth devoting an enormous amount of resources to making sure that those things, that genie is kept in the bottle.
As well as a very distinguished panel here, we've actually got a remarkably distinguished audience there. So I think it would be great if we spent the remaining half hour or so getting some questions from you. What I think, assuming that a forest of hands is going to go up, though I may be wrong, I will take 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 questions to start with, and then come back to the panel, and hopefully we can have at least a couple of rounds. If you could identify yourself as you ask the question, that would be great. So I see a lady over there straight away.
Debbie Abraham. Can you hear it?
Yep.
Debbie Abrahams, I'm the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth. Interestingly, we've just been debating in the House the flatlining, or rather the decline in some parts of the country, and for women in life expectancy, and obviously inequalities is a key driver in this. But I wondered, we know a lot about inequalities in income, we know a lot about inequalities in wealth. Are you going to be exploring, for example, inequalities in power, and particularly in relation to the rise in populism, both here and in the US?
Great, thank you. That's a great question. There's a lot. There's a gentleman there. There's one here.
Hi, I'm Steve Brace from the Royal Geographical Society. Really interested to hear about how inequality plays out horizontally at the global scale and population scale. And Penny mentioned about the geographical dimension to this. And I just wonder whether, is it that inequalities bring in geographical differences to different places, but is there also something in the nature of certain places that plays out in terms of how inequality impacts both on communities and places themselves?
Could I ask what you mean by the nature of certain places?
Well, it's where communities live, it's where there's different factors across population types, it's whether places are internationally connected or locally connected, and it's the nature of those places that impact on their economic prosperity and otherwise.
Okay.
Hi, David Freud. The most depressing book I read over the last year was written by Walter Scheidel, The Great Leveller, which, for those who haven't read it, basically says inequality is the natural state of the economy, and there's only 4 things that stop it, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are, if I remember rightly, total war, state breakdown, violent, a communist revolution has to be violent, and plague. So be careful what you wish for is his last line in this book. But it's the most, as I say, the most depressing book I've read, and one which I would find the answer from the panel very interesting.
Blimey, the most depressing book until our report, anyway. One more.
Hitan Shah from the Royal Statistical Society. Don't worry, it's not going to be a stats question. There's quite a big debate in the development world around how far they care about reducing poverty and how far inequality is the issue. So for this commission to have bites, how far are you going to focus upon the top as opposed to just pushing up the people at the bottom, as it were? And I suppose I'd be interested both in your kind of analytical frame for in which situations is it tackling the top that's important, and also your kind of actual appetite as a commission to do that. Great, thank you. I'd rather you didn't all try and answer all of those questions so that we have time for others. But I mean, Deborah, it looked like you fancied answering that last question about the importance of inequality versus poverty. To what extent are we going to focus on one rather than the other?
So I think that's a great question because those are clearly different. Somebody could care about poverty and not care at all about inequality. China has done a great job in taking people out of poverty. Of course, there's been a growth of inequality at the same time. So those are different dimensions. They're connected in one way in my mind, which is the existence of inequality, the existence of wealth, shows you that extreme poverty is not a natural fact that we can't do anything about because there are some surplus resources in the society that could be redistributed. Again, there might be trade-offs, but it's not just a fact of nature. I'm hoping the panel, and certainly the part that I'll frame, will try to disentangle those, to think about where is it that we think the problem really is poverty, but the inequality creates obstacles to solving the poverty question, right? Because there are political interests at stake that are opposed to redistribution. And where is it, even in the absence of poverty, we have reason to care about inequality? So just take, for example, inequalities in political power or political influence. That's certainly a problem because of poverty, but it's a problem even in the absence of poverty if the super rich, the top 1%, can differentially impose policy options across even the middle class. But I think it's important to think of when is it that our objection really is about poverty or about the bottom or preference for the least well off, and where is it's the inequality that matters. And again, take education, that's another nice example for thinking, when is it we care, we want to bring everybody up to a certain minimum, and when is it we actually care not just about bringing somebody up to the minimum, but the inequalities that obtain.
Angus, can I ask you, come to you about with Debbie Abrahams' question about power and the extent to which we're going to focus on that as an issue?
I thought you were going to ask me to tackle Scheidel, which...
Well, do feel free to do plague and revolution as well, if you'd like.
I think power, yeah. I mean, I didn't use the word, but I think, when I think about access to politics and the fact that some people's voice are heard and other people's voice are not heard, I think that's a terrible inequality of itself. And one of the things I've been pushing very hard, and occasionally I see someone's eyes open and they pick up on this, is I don't think of inequalities in, it's not a question of some bad things are driven by inequalities in income. A lot of people have formulated the problem that way. And I think that might be true. Deborah talked about the consequences of inequality. But that's not my concern. My concern is that, material well-being is not everything. There's a huge number of things that matter to people's lives beyond material well-being. And one of those is participation in society, power, if you like. And so not having power, not feeling that people like you have a vote, have a part in running parliament, is a deprivation in of itself. It is an inequality that's a bad thing by itself, and it doesn't have to be caused by some other inequality. And the same is true of health, for instance, and the terrible things that are happening to health. I mean, it's dying that's the problem, not the fact that someone else is healthier than you are, right? And power, though, is much more an issue where if you have it, someone else doesn't have it. And so there is an inherent, it's natural to think about that in terms of inequality. And I do think that the populism, as Tim talked about, that we see today in so much of the rich world is just because people feel that people like them are not participating in this anymore. Or that in the original meritocratic book, Michael Young's book, that the people who would have represented those people have been stolen from the working class and become people like us who don't represent. We were talking in a panel meeting today about how can we involve people in the panel who come from those left behind places. And as we went around the room, all of our fathers came from those left behind places, all of our mothers. So we come from them at one remove, but that's not good enough because that's actually sort of the problem. And we've got all the power, and the people that those people used to have through people like them has gone away.
Tim, war, violent revolution, plague. It's the only solution. I mean, do you see the sort of inevitable progress of market society as well towards more inequality, and it really does take something incredibly dramatic to reverse that? Or are you slightly more optimistic?
I'm much more optimistic. Partly, I mean, the reason we study history is to take on board the lessons from it and try and do better than our forebears. I mean, I think the example I draw on that is I sat on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee during the financial crisis, and the one thing we were determined to do was not to create a second Great Depression, and the lessons of history were very central to the response that was taken in the financial crisis. Otherwise, we may well have ended up in the situation of the 1930s, not just with its economic consequences, but also its political consequences. Now, some of what's going on today is unfinished business, I would argue, from some aspects of what went on in the financial crisis, and those are the parts of it that we really need to address and to tackle. But the very fact we're here now, we're debating those issues, and we are cognizant of the consequences of this, particularly some of the huge changes that happened in our politics in the mid part of the 20th century with the reversal of democratic decision-making throughout Europe. I think, and that should be sufficiently salient to all of us sitting here, that we have to get on and do something about this without waiting for the apocalypse.
Could I move on to this question of place? Perhaps Lucinda and Penny, you could address this. I think it's going to be quite central to a lot of what we do. How important is place, and what is it about place that we're concerned about?
So yes, I think it's a really, really interesting question. What is the nature of place? How does place impact people, and why? So the issue of place and mobility was already mentioned. You can think about why do people stay in places where there aren't opportunities? Who moves, and what's the consequences of those who perhaps are most able to move moving away? What does that mean? Who's left for those who are left behind? But there's also the other sort of mobility, which is mobility related to sort of social mobility from the institutions, and how there are maybe very unequal sorts of institutions and services in place. Differential sort of access to housing markets, or to being able to actually move house as well, which constrains people's mobility and their social mobility. And I think we need to think about that there are things that can be fixed. Perhaps there are things that perhaps can be done on education. There are things that are harder to fix, even if they weren't accidental originally. I mean, you think about closing of mines and the long-term consequences of that for the populations in those areas. That isn't something that can be straightforwardly fixed now, but we can think more about, okay, what have been the long-term consequences of that, and how do they affect different generations? I suppose those are all issues we want to look at a bit more, but place is also important to people. So I think another issue we want to look at is this issue of community, and how place relates to community, how people feel belonging to place, how people feel belonging to South Wales even after they are no longer coal miners, or are no longer actively coal miners. What are the different influences that mean that maybe they don't move, or they can't move, or that they're constrained?
And Penny, you said earlier that one of the key impacts of globalization has been very much place specific. You don't have to add to that, but I wondered if you wanted to.
So first, let me start by saying I think the notion of place is key when we talk about inequality. Starting with the fact that, so one notion of place is the country in which you are born in, and we decided to focus on Europe and the UK in this review, but one of the most striking achievements of the post-World War II era is the reduction in global inequality. So within country, inequality increased, but global inequality, so the distance between the average person living in a developing country and the average American or the average British, is lower than any time in the past. So this is one of the great achievements. And when we talk here about the increase in inequality, we actually make a value judgment that inequality within our countries matters more to us than global inequality. And by the way, this is also, even John Rawls stopped short from addressing global inequality. So this is a very strong value judgment. So if we apply this criterion to our thinking when we approach this problem, it's very natural to extend it to within country inequality, and even within countries, the place where you were born or the place where you live is going to be important. In the past, what economists often said, in a slightly different context, was when jobs were adversely affected either by trade or by technology or by some other policy reforms, we always said we don't protect jobs, we protect people. And I think we are at the point where perhaps we may start thinking about also protecting places, not just people, because people are attached to their places. And there is a lot of work that has shown that it's not people that are affected. So when you have an adverse outcome, then there are spillovers to the whole community around them. So this is perhaps something we can think about in the context of the review.
Okay, we've got time very quickly for one last round of questions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, those I didn't get in. So it doesn't matter which way. Why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Grace Atush. I'm from the London School of Economics. I wanted to ask a question about inequality between the generations. So for many decades in this country, there's been this idea that each generation should do better than the generation before us. And we're getting to the point for the first time, really, where that's not going to be the case for the youngest generation. And that's sort of been seen in sort of issues with buying housing, issues with low pay. So I was wondering sort of what's the agenda really to address this in sort of the next couple of years?
Okay, great.
From the
in society. There's been a lot of discussion tonight about political power. Can I ask the panel about power in our everyday lives, sort of practical power within relationships, within our communities, at work, as consumers, and in relation to the state, powerlessness, people doing things to you. It feels that that is an incredibly important dimension, but also very difficult to measure, difficult to conceptualize, and to solve. So I think that that would be a really fantastic area for your inquiry to focus on.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you. Vanda Vaporska, Executive Director of the Equality Trust, and we're the national charity that campaigns to reduce inequality. Thank you for increasing my media workload today. It's always great to see inequality in the headlines. But I'd also like to say that I'd like to ask more about what Angus said this morning in the involvement of people with lived experience, particularly at the sharp end of inequality, but also at the top end, and how the panel plans to engage with the general public to bring in people with lived experience, really, I think, to flesh out the research, which, we know what the research tells us, but what is really important is how inequality is affecting people's everyday lives.
Richard here.
Thank you. Richard Layard. You've been talking about all these different dimensions of inequality, which is excellent. But wouldn't it be wonderful if one could find some way of combining them into some single measure of the person's quality of life? And of course, we've got that because we've got the measures of subjective well-being. Angus has done wonderful work on that. So, to put it strongly, shouldn't that be your overall concept, your central concept of inequality? Or at least, to put it weakly, isn't it a dimension of inequality that you should be looking at?
Great, thank you. I'm sorry to everyone else who wanted to ask questions, but we are running right up against the end of time, as it were. Let me take the one on intergenerational inequality, because that is something we've done a lot of work on at the IFS, and it clearly matters enormously in all of this, and it's part of the consequence of a series of economic policies, a series of mistakes in policy, and has a big impact, I think, on people's views and power and all sorts of other things in terms of their lack of ownership, particularly among younger people. So rest assured, we will be focusing a lot on what the drivers of intergenerational inequality are, as well as what some of the consequences of that have been, and we will learn, I think, from history in doing that. Who would like to take the question about power in everyday lives? Because I think that is an important issue, and maybe wrap that up also in Richard's question about what it is that we're really worried about. Because the other question is, shouldn't we just be worried about well-being, happiness? That's the thing that matters in the end.
I could say a few words about power in everyday life. I think this is really very, very important. And I think people want lots of things from their lives other than material well-being. And I would actually argue they want more from their lives than Richard's measure of well-being, though we've argued about that a great deal. And we are very interested in mechanisms as much as measures. But let me tackle the everyday life. I think a lot of things have come apart in people's everyday lives and their control over their everyday lives. So I think the decline in the union movement, which I mentioned, gave people a lot of power that they don't have anymore. Now, maybe that power was abused, and many people are welcome not seeing those as abuses of power anymore. But, having unions at work gave people a certain amount of control over their everyday lives. Another thing that I worried about, well, and not only that, but the social life that went with it was, I think, very important. Another thing that I'm worried about a lot is domestic outsourcing, so that people don't belong to the firm anymore. So, if ICI were still there, its janitors and support staff and drivers and the people who cook the meals wouldn't work for ICI anymore. They would work for some manpower thing that treats people much worse and much more seriously, to which they don't belong. So you have a sense of control and a sense of belonging to a firm, even if you're the janitors in some large corporation. You see this over and over again, especially like in my parents' generation. You know, working for one of those firms was really important part of their lives. They were proud of it. And even if they had very lowly roles. And it's very hard to be proud of working for the Ram Jam Cleaning Corporation or whatever it's called. And so I think that's done a lot. And you know, the other thing that's happened is if you reduce people's wages over a long enough period, it begins to affect their marital relationships, the way they partner up. And we've seen a lot of this in the US, so that there's a lot of dysfunction going on. And once again, in this less educated white community in the US, the modal mother has at least had one child out of wedlock. So, you know, there's just really a terrible deterioration. And people have these serial cohabitations in which they stay together for a few years, they have kids, they then move to another relationship in which they have other kids, and you get to be someone in your 50s, a man in his 50s, whose kids are all living with other men and he doesn't know them anymore. And you know, no wonder people are turning to suicide and drugs and things. So I think this is just a real loss of control. And a lot of it in America is because the system has done so little to cushion people against these changes that are happening in the labor market. I can't solve it all, but I think there's some part of it that's important.
Well, if we can solve any of it, we'll be doing well. Deborah, can I come to you with Richard's question about why don't we wrap all of this up into a measure of well-being?
So I think it would be a big mistake to try to sum up these different dimensions, because you would lose the fact that there are really different, not all of the dimensions of concern are about well-being. There are dimensions of concern that are about procedures. There are dimensions of concern that are about other kinds of consequences besides well-being consequences. So if you knew a number, like it was, I had 19 and Angus had 22, you would be obscuring, you know, what really matters, because what often really matters to people is not that sum, but the different aspects of their lives that you don't get to reveal by just having that sum. So I think I would like to, you know, us to keep heterogeneity in our approach, because I think reality is complex, the dimensions are complicated, and they don't just easily sum up to one simple thing.
But we will certainly look at those numbers.
We will. You will.
Well, I mean, let me end by giving a slightly unsatisfactory answer to the question about how we're going to involve people with lived experience of inequality. The answer is we are committed to doing that. We're going to do some work on attitudes, and we're going to do some work on experiences. We're not at the moment knowing exactly how we're going to do that. So let me end by saying this isn't the end of it, because we have one more speaker, but let me end at this moment by saying to this audience, I mean, we are wanting this to be a program of work which is engaging certainly all of you and a much wider group. So do get in touch with us if you'd like to be involved, if you've got things you'd like to say to us, if you've got ideas, you could email me, or which my email address is easily available, or the IFS. You look through the website, because you know, we have a degree of experience and expertise. You have vastly more, and we want to draw on as much of that as we possibly can through that process. I know that's not the question you were asking about the broader engagement, but it's one tiny step perhaps to getting as much input as we can. I'm sorry I haven't been. Did you want to say anything very final before we move on? Sorry, I didn't bring the two of you in. Penny?
No, I just had a very quick reaction to this question about using one measure of well-being, and while I agree that we want to do the complexity of the issue justice, I just want to say that there has been demand for extending GDP or per capita GDP, so the usual measures we use to measure welfare, to extend these measures by including other indicators of quality of life, including health, including inequalities, a measure of inequality. So you know, so what you suggested doesn't seem so far off what we may see in the future.
We'll have some interesting discussions about that. I think we as a panel should shut up at this point. I want to hand over now briefly to Tim Gardam, who is probably the most important person in the room because he's responsible for the Nuffield Foundation, who in the end are the people who have made this whole thing possible through their generous support.
How does one follow that? I'm not going to try to summarise this evening. After all, this great project's only just begun. But I think I will say that we at Nuffield, plus everybody else in this room, I imagine, are now somewhat fixated how this panel will corral the range of this agenda and shape it into something. I was asked to say why Nuffield was funding the review. I have to say I think that's now rather self-evident. But I will say a little bit. The IFS and Nuffield have had a long relationship. We've co-funded the IFS Green Budget for a number of years, and we have currently another 8 grants underway. Paul Johnson is very persuasive. However, the Deaton Review is something rather different. It is by far the most ambitious, not to say the most expensive project we have supported for some years. And we've been closely engaged with it from its inception and will continue to be so. Because the issues the Deaton Review will address frame so many different aspects of Nuffield's overall purpose. And we hope its findings will act as a spur to further exploration in future Nuffield research projects from others within the Academy and beyond. Now, this evening we've already heard a great deal to take forward, because the programme that's been set out has emerged out of some months, as Richard Blundell said at the beginning, of defining its scope and its research. And this was much more than just an application process. As Richard said, it was a real and robust discussion between the IFS and the Nuffield Foundation Steering Committee, chaired by Colette, and I would like to thank her colleagues Martin Wheel, Susan Harkness, Francis O'Grady, Terry Moffat and Samir Shah for being Nuffield's independent voices. Truth be told, however, Nuffield was convinced about this from the moment Sir Angus emerged on Skype as a somewhat unstable digital image from his rooms in Princeton. But through the haze, he set out with a clear and urgent force, and if I may say so, with the same moral urgency that we've heard this evening and across the media today, why this project was so necessary and why he'd chosen it as the one thing to which he was prepared to commit his time. He explained then, as we've heard today, how it would start from philosophical foundations, defining what we understand by inequalities, and the extent to which we could be concerned about them, and the reasons. It was always to be a project with an international comparative context, but with a clear reference to its particular manifestations in the United Kingdom. And as he delineated and interwove its many strands, its ambition became apparent to us all. There has, of course, been a temptation to include all matters of additional angles, and there have been many more that have emerged in questions tonight. We recognise that even with an expert panel as renowned as this, and with the IFS engine powering the process, the project still faces something of a challenge of reconciling depth and breadth. But we were struck by the fact that though it has economics at its heart, it will also rely on the insights of so many other disciplines entering into its bloodstream, as it surveys the inequalities of gender and place, ethnicity and disability, as we've heard, and as the discussion tonight has brought out, its impact on the home and on family life. It seems to me that in our contemporary culture, as this discussion has made clear, concepts of identity are now sit intertwined with issues of inequalities in arguments about what constitutes a fair and emancipated society. And Nuffield has been very anxious in talking about this to encourage a wide intellectual engagement that at the same time as it seeks carefully to delineate arguments, remains incorrigibly plural. As Angus said just now, we want to hear a lot of voices in this. However, I think there remains a related challenge. In a world where arguments based on expert analysis are often felt to be at odds with individuals' perceptions of their own experience, it is for this reason that we've encouraged there to be an element of public deliberation as part of this project, as Richard and others have mentioned, because that will underscore the legitimacy of the research for a wider audience and we want to explore the use of deliberative methods better to understand public understanding of these inequalities. I noticed this morning on the BBC Today programme the appetite for such public engagement was immediate. So one test of the success of this review will be our joint ability to ensure that its insights reach beyond the elites of policy making and, however indirectly, have some connection with those whom this report has as its focus. This seems to me all the more important in the context of the accelerating impact of a digitally driven society. Because for all their potential for emancipation, the new technologies leave all in doubt. They are causing old certainties and boundaries of geography, culture, and society to dissolve. And they're also spreading a more fissile public discourse, one where trust in complex argument that adduces evidence is increasingly challenged. I've been struck recently by the emergence of a recent term in the digital society lexicon, agnotology, the strategic manufacture of ignorance, the purposeful seeding of doubt to fragment societies and that fragments epistemologies. It's been described as a new instrument of oppression. I'd suggest that one inequality facing the next generation may be the inequality of access to the trustworthy data and information necessary to be a reliably informed citizen in a democracy, which must be a precondition of democratic capitalism. The Deaton Review can in itself be a bulwark against that tide. It will set out with a rigorous purpose to define principles, analyse the evidence and test potential remedies. And it should be part of Nuffield's job to help it fight for attention in the many different contexts of our fragmenting civic discourse. Indeed, to Nuffield, one of the most exciting aspects of the whole review is the prospect of its final output, a shorter, authored synopsis with Sir Angus's distinct signature that will crystallise for the wider, interested, non-academic audience what is at stake for all our futures. It was in April 1943 that Lord Nuffield created this foundation to promote the scientific method, the improvement of education, and the advancement of social well-being. It was just a matter of months after publication of the Beveridge report that Sir Angus referenced earlier. Now, when I first listened to Sir Angus setting out his vision for this project, I was reminded that the Beveridge report sold 100,000 copies in its first month and went on to sell a further 600,000 in a shorter, cheaper version. Now, this is not exactly a KPI or target for Sir Angus and his colleagues. But the aims and ambition of what they are setting out to do, I hope and think could be as important to our time as were those debates of 75 years ago about the future of the social contract in a democratic society. And this is why we are proud to fund and support this work and to take an active part in ensuring its impact and success. So thank you to Sir Angus, to all the panel, to the IFS for all they have done to drive this and for organising this evening, and to all of you for being here. And I think we can now continue the conversation in drinks across the corridor. Thank you.